Okay. So we'd love to hear about other things that your churches are doing as a result of either tonight's workshop or other workshops that we've run in the past, and perhaps some of the things that you're doing to take action on climate change. And we'd love you to send us your stories and case studies so that we can share them with the rest of the diocese via our bulletin and our platform, our knowledge platform, just to encourage others to perhaps start their journey to net zero and Eco Church Awards. So please do keep in touch with us via our emails, and I will put those in the chat as we go through. If you haven't already filled in the Google form that was attached to your Eventbrite confirmation, could you please do so before the end of the workshop? Again, I'll put that into the chat in a moment, but it's just important that we monitor the demographics that we're reaching to help us better understand how we can engage more people. So thank you for taking the time to fill that in. As I said, any questions that you think of during the meeting, if you want to pop those in the chat, and then I'll direct them to the appropriate speaker, but there will be opportunities for you to do that, and you can just click on the raise the hand, and I'll ask you to unmute and to ask your question. Before I introduce our first speaker, would you all mind just writing your name, your church or organisation in the chat, please, so that people can see where we're all from? I'll just give you a moment to do that.
Yeah, that's more than
Everyone. I see we've got a real spread of people across Merseyside.
No, Richard's good. No, hold on. It's a pretty good spread on the denominations these days.
If you could just check that you're muted, that would be great, please. And Hilary, you could stay unmuted because you're up next. So I'd now like to introduce our first speaker, who's Hilary Ash. So Hilary holds degrees in botany from Oxford and Liverpool universities and worked as a botanical consultant until retirement. She is a retired member of CIEEM, and her professional work included much botanical survey and management advisory work, mainly in urban areas, including wildflower habitat creation with organisations such as Landlife, Forestry Commission, Natural England and National Trust. She has been for over 30 years the Honorary Conservation Officer for Rural Wildlife, and she was awarded Cheshire Woman of the Year in 2017 for environmental work. Well, I think that deserves a little clap, Hilary. That is amazing. She was given the Green Flag Volunteer for the year 2016 for her work in helping start and run the New Ferry Butterfly Park. And Wirral Wildlife holds the award, the Queen's Award, for voluntary service, awarded in 2017. Hilary is also the Green Champion for St David's URC Easton in Wirral, and has found herself advising a number of local churches and community groups on managing their grounds in wildlife-friendly ways. Hilary, really looking forward to hearing all you've got to say this evening. So over to you.
Right, I shall share my screen. Look, share. There. Yeah. Hopefully everybody can see that.
Yep.
Good, right. So, looking after wildlife in churchyards. First of all, do you know what's sharing your church grounds with you already? Do some surveys. Your congregation might be able to do them. What plants have you got? What trees? Maybe what animals? If you need help, there are plenty of local experts around. Ask at your local records centres, your county wildlife trust, because you really do need to know what's there before you start doing anything. It might be just buttercups and daisies, But don't knock that. That bumblebee is having a jolly good feed on that buttercup. And you could find yourself with something unusual. So St. Peter's Delamere turned out to have some nice acid soil grassland with heath bedstraw and heath speedwell. Even my own little urban church turned out to have mining bees. And St. John's in Sandyway had these lovely waxcap fungi, which are markers for important long-lived grassland, which incidentally fixes a lot of carbon. Whatever you've got, tell people about it, even if it's just a notice in a tree, or as we've got at church at the moment, some little notices stuck in the grass. It's important that all your congregation, but also everybody else who uses your grounds, appreciates what's already there. Then think about how you manage your grounds. There's probably areas you have to keep short mown and formal, around the entrance to the church, where the bride has her photographs taken, where the most visited graves are. But there might be areas, as on the right there, where you can afford to be a little less close with the mowing and let the plants to flower. That's St. Mary's Eastham. By the way, that yew tree by the church there is of the order of 1600 years old. If you do have nice important trees in your churchyard, do make sure you have ways of looking after them properly. That's right, my son is just shorting out somebody who'd unmuted accidentally. Thank you, Richard. That won't move. That's the link. And this doesn't have to be complicated. That's what we did for our own church. Got a street map down, marked out the areas, said, all right, A needs to be fairly close mown because that's where the mums and tots play. D needs to be fairly close mown because that's the other side of the entrance. And what we did with B, C and D was that. We give it a tidy up mow in April if it needs it, and then it's left till August. And as you can see, it just gets a strip mown along the path because that immediately makes it look cared for and deliberate. And we have put some notices in about the wildflowers. There's not an awful lot in it, but there's lots of the yellow is the dandelion look-alike, that's cat's ear. And there's bird's foot trefoil, and there's daisies, and there's a few other things. But it's a good nectar source and pollen for the local bees, and it's reasonably attractive. And once it's all cut down, it goes in the compost bins. That's actually my home ones, because I found I hadn't got a picture of the church ones, but just built out of old pallets and old wood. And the compost gets used in our vegetable beds or goes off with various allotment gardeners to their allotments. Now, what I'm aiming to get you to encourage you to do is to think about the plants and the invertebrates, especially the insects, for several reasons. The insects have declined very badly. We've probably only got a quarter of the number of flying insects we had 50 years ago. And that, of course, matters because they support the birds and the bats and everything else. They are what do the pollination of the wildflowers, of our garden flowers, and very importantly, of our crops, a lot of which need insect pollinators. And you can do good to invertebrates in quite a small area. And most of our churchyards aren't terribly large. So the first thing to be said is, please don't use any pesticides. Even herbicides tend to have side effects on soil invertebrates. So unless you're absolutely forced to, because you've got Japanese knotweed or something to deal with, just don't use the pesticides. The second thing to think about is having nectar and pollen all season from March, April through to September. Some insects like bumblebees need it for a long time. Others need it specific times, so you just have to have a variety. So don't knock the humble dandelion. It's very good nectar and pollen source for insects coming out of hibernation. You could follow on with the primula family. That happens to be native cowslips at the Butterfly Park, but garden primulas will do as well. Include your trees. that single flowered cherry is very good. Double flowered cherries are hopeless. In fact, double flowers of almost any sort are hopeless, so avoid them. The daisy family are good, whether it's the wild oxeye or any of our cultivated daisies. So's the pea family. That happens to be bird's foot trefoil, but red and white clover. And the cranesbill family, of which we've got a lot of cultivated forms, but they're all good. And right the way through the season, maybe finishing with Michaelmas daisies. A number of those are not natives. For nectar and pollen, that doesn't greatly matter. Having some natives is good because you're likely to attract leaf-eating insects. But there doesn't have to be those for nectar and pollen. There's lots of advice on the internet about this, and Emma will be sending out in a week or two's time a file I've put together with contact details for a lot of these advice and suppliers. But just look at things, websites like Wild About Gardens or Butterfly Conservation, Bumblebee Conservation. There's plenty of advice, plenty of lists, and you can choose what fits your soil, your amount of water, and so forth. Now back to that survey. What does it tell you about your soil? A good botanist can use that to tell you. If you've got fertile soil, and if you release the mowing, it goes a bit like this. Long grass, not many flowers. Then fertile soil is very difficult to sustain wildflowers in. So don't go down that route. Think perhaps about trees, maybe even an orchard, or shrubs with flowers and fruit. If, on the other hand, your soil turns out to be quite infertile with low levels of phosphate and nitrogen, sometimes marked by things like that little common spotted orchid, then even if it's mostly grass at the moment, you should be able to add wildflowers in, like the purple knapweed there, and the yellow is rough hawkbit, and they're about to come out and make a beautiful nectar pollen source for August. Now, there's two ways of doing that. You can do it from seed, but if you do, you've got to have bare soil. Now, that isn't a churchyard. It happens to be Everton Park, which is rather bigger. But you can't sow wildflower seed into an existing grassland. It just don't work. So if you want to completely resow an area, you have got to strip off the grass, get back to bare soil, and then it works perfectly well. That's St. Peter's Everton in the background, but that's Everton Fields. If you don't want to be doing that amount of hard work or a smaller area, then try this way. What they're doing is taking off the turf from little squares about 1/2 metre each way, and then into each of them we planted 3 or 4 wildflower plants. One species for each square, things like knapweed and oxeye daisy and scabious. You can buy wildflower plants, but you can more cheaply raise your own from seed. They're not difficult. Emma will send out some methods of doing that, but they're easily available on the web. With plants, you're probably going to need to look after them for a year or so, a bit of weeding, a bit of watering, if it's like last summer, very dry, not like this summer. And then they just need managing appropriately with certainly at least one cut. But Harriet's going to talk a lot more about management, so I'm going to leave that to her. What I've talked about so far are perennial wildflowers. Don't get them muddled up with cornfield annuals. Cornfield annuals, like poppies and cornflowers, they were the weeds of our cornfields, wheat, barley, oats, and they need annual soil disturbance to continue seeding and growing. So if you have a cornfield annual patch, each winter you've got to plough and harrow it, even if you're doing it with a fork and a hoe. And that gets a lot of hard work. They are very good gap fillers. So if you've cleared an area one winter and you're not putting in your permanent planting until the next winter, throw a seed packet of that round and you'll get a lovely display and some nice nectar and pollen for the summer. Just don't expect it to persist. You can use them as nurses to perennial wildflowers if you're sowing a seed mix. Again, you do need to educate people that That'll come up first year and then it'll rapidly fade, but the perennials will come through instead. If you really haven't got any of those scales, what about a few raised beds? We've got 3 at my church. This one sits in the sun, so we use it for some vegetables. Those broad beans were very nice for the bees when it flowered, mainly so that we can educate some of our mums and tots mums into using fresh veg. We also have a semi-shaded one with black currants in it. And then we have a herb bed. And I would encourage anybody with a bit of sunny space somewhere to grow some herbs. They're very easy to care for once they are established. When they flower, they are lovely nectar and pollen sources. That was taken this week on the perennial marjoram. And of course, you can use them in your cooking. So think about things like chives and thyme, rosemary, perennial marjoram. They are all so easy and so good to do. Now, that's nectar and pollen and food, but insects and invertebrates in general also need shelter for when it pours with rain in July and to hibernate in over winter. So if you're having to have a shrub or a tree cut back, hang on to some of the wood and make a log pile out of it. It might be a bit more tidy than that one, but just put it in a shady place somewhere. If you've got a hedge or shrubs, manage them so they're nice and dense, not leggy and thin, but are dense all the way down to the ground, so they're good shelter. We're lucky, we've got a hawthorn hedge. Rural Countryside Volunteers hedge laid it for us a few years ago. And so we have a nice dense hedge, which a couple of clips a year keeps in good condition. You might have somebody who could drill some holes and a few logs for you, make a bee house, put that in the sun. Bees like sun. And everybody likes building a bug house. Doesn't have to be quite as pretty as Meadow Park's one, but the children greatly enjoyed that one. And it won't be just bees, of course. Hoverflies are very good pollinators. So are some of the beetles. Butterflies aren't particularly, but everybody likes to see them. But whatever you're doing, tell everybody, preferably before you do it, but certainly as you do it, explain why. Use whatever means you have, social media, church magazines, pictures in church, pictures in the church hall, and on site as well. Whether that's simple little A4 sheet laminated sheets, or when you've got something going, something more established like that. They're fairly expensive to buy. They're called lecterns, but very easy because we undo 3 screws, slide the plastic out, and you can change the content behind just like that. If you've got a good woodworker, they'll probably make one for you. But do tell everybody what you're doing and why. You'll still get some comeback from the tidy-minded brigade who like everything mown with an inch of its life. But the more you explain, the less you're likely to have of that. That's me for now. I'm going to stop screen sharing.
Thank you, Hilary. That was really, really interesting. I'm definitely going to watch this again because there was loads of things I wanted to write down there. If anybody's got any questions for Hilary, you can either type them in the chat or you can just raise your hand or just unmute yourself and ask. That's absolutely fine. Go for it. Don't be shy. Anybody done any of the things that Hilary's talked about at their church or in their gardens, or had experience that they want to share?
Elaine at Holy Trinity wants to.
We've done quite a bit of this at St Luke's. We've done the herb garden, which is an raised bed, which is like a sensory garden for people who are disabled in wheelchairs. And we've got a lot of fruit and veg growing down at the grounds as well, quite a mix.
Steve?
Just to say that the point that Hilary was making about what people prefer to see in the management of church grounds is a really critical point. We've got a feeling excuse me, I think in our area, St Luke's in the heart of Crosby, there's a feeling that graveyards should be manicured and, as you said, Hilary, mown to an inch of their life. And even within our own management and maintenance team, there are differing views as to how close to mow the grass. And in fact, with these milder winters we've been having, we start to mow in February and don't finish mowing until November. Now, a number of us would maybe like to see a different approach to that, and we do leave some selected areas to grow longer and then scythe that. We've got 4.5 acres altogether, so there is quite a big area, mainly filled with graves, but obviously the runs of rows between the graves. So just to say, it is an active discussion area that I don't think we've got to the end of yet.
No, and that's a big area to be managing as well. Yes, it is a difficult thing. And I think you're right to start with selecting a few areas and getting people used to the idea of a few corners, and then perhaps gradually, discreetly expanding that each year. But
one of the things that we had been thinking of doing, haven't done it quite yet, was to say that we were managing the grounds for conservation. So whether some areas were cut short or other areas were left to grow longer, the whole approach would be to manage it for conservation. But as I say, our ambition, I guess, is to change the way we do it at the moment. But I think it will take a while to get to that point.
But do also make sure when you are leaving it, it looks attractive. So if you need to add extra shrubs or extra wildflowers in, choose the areas to leave long where something will flower. It's amazing what if people see something flower, they suddenly accept it. Long grass is valuable for things like grasshoppers and small mammals, but it's much more acceptable if there's a flower in it.
We have been using yellow rattle in some areas as well to try and outcompete the grass and give something that is more biodiverse.
Yes, yellow rattle is a useful plant. If you don't know it, it's parasitic on grasses, so it lessens the vigor of the grasses. It won't attack the really big bunchy grasses, things like cocksfoot, but it is very good at lessening the bents and the fescues and that. It's quite picky. Either it likes you and it grows like mad, or it isn't, in which case it sulks. But you do need very fresh seed. So the time to do it is September, and get fresh seed from that year. Cut your grass short, scatter the seed on, rake or walk it in, and hope that the next year is going to come up. And of course, if it does, don't cut the grass before it seeds. It's a strict annual. There's a note in the chat from Kath Pace saying, do we still do Forest Church? And the answer is yes, but we've been a bit distracted this year, so we've only done one. But Judith is planning to do one, I think end of September, beginning October, because that's when we've actually got a bit of gap in the church timetable. So keep an eye on St David's United Reformed Church Eastham Facebook page or website.
Anybody else?
Jonathan Ivy, someone there.
Yeah.
Hi. I've got some purple creeping thyme, and I was wondering if you could recommend, is it that you should plant it always so that it's in the sun for a minimum of 6 hours? Is that what you would recommend?
Yes, I mean, the 6 hours isn't absolutely strict, but it does need to get the sun for some of the day for time to thrive. And of course, the insects will feed on it more in the sun. So yes, try and choose a reasonably sunny spot for it. Our herb garden gets, I think, high summer, probably about 6 or 7 hours sun a day. That's all. And it seems to do all right.
Yeah, I'm talking about 60 plants to put around the churchyard, and I'm trying to work out the best places to put it. I mean, are you allowed to put it around near the stones of the graveyard? Are you allowed to do that kind of thing?
That will depend purely on the rules of your graveyard, if it's a church one.
Right.
Yeah, probably. It's I mean, the family, if any graves are looked after by the families, then obviously not without their permission. But graves that aren't being looked after, I wouldn't have thought it'd be a problem, but do just check that with the powers that be.
Yeah, okay, will do.
So I've got a couple of people with their hands up. So Colin and Ivy, were you going to ask a question? And then I've got Jenny and then Annette and Drew. Colin and Ivy, I think you can't hear you. Do you want to type your question in the chat? And we can answer that in a second. Jenny, do you want to ask a question?
Hi, we're probably talking about the same church. We've got a small piece of grass which has to be kept mown really because of brownies and rainbows and other groups using it. And we don't really have a lot of other grass like wildland, apart from just near the front around a tree. So maybe that's the only area we could let go a little bit wild. And we have one person who looks after the garden and he doesn't want any extra works. Kind of neat, and we don't want to lose him. So we have to find a balance between what we do. So maybe that's the only piece of ground we could really use.
Well, if that's underneath a tree, then of course there's quite a few spring woodland wildflowers. I'm thinking of things like stitchworts and bluebells and that, which you could plant under there. And all it would need would be that he misses one mow in the spring and doesn't mow them down until beginning of June or something like that. So, it would, and in some of the other things you can get in cultivation, things like wood anemone or even the wild garlic, which is naturally a woodland species, and which you can also eat, of course, they will die down to their roots anyway. So a few of the real woodland spring wildflowers under the tree might be useful, and then he could just not mow it until June, which should probably be quite acceptable.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Drew and Annette.
Hi, on the north side of our church, we've got a passageway which gets no sun at all. It's tarmac, and tarmac's been degraded by frost action, and we used to every year try and remove the moss that was growing on it, and then a few years ago we decided to stop trying to remove the moss. So the moss has colonized the tarmac, and then what used to be called weeds have now also colonized the moss. Have you got any advice, Hilary, on what other plants we could put there, or seeds that could be scattered that would do well in that shaded area in those sorts of conditions?
Right, so basically you're looking at a very early succession, naturally, of moss and then little plants colonizing that. Any of the plants that low growing but don't need much soil, I'm thinking of self-heal, bird's foot trefoil, white or red clover, white clover in particular. Yeah, things probably not damp enough for bugle, but you could try it. Wild strawberry, low growing, short growing plants that won't have a lot of water demand and will grow in shade, although they won't necessarily do a lot of flowering, but they'll creep along. Creeping cinquefoil, come to that. A lot of ones there which creep, so if you get a few in, they will then do the strawberry trick. They'll throw out runners and more plants will appear on the end, so you can just put a few in and leave them to spread. That's probably where you are. It's probably not thick enough soil to get the shade tolerant woodland stuff in. They'd need a bit more soil.
Thank you. Well, we had thought of having a go at it and cracking the tarmac open further, giving it a bit of help.
Yeah, over a century of being sealed in underneath might not be totally good soil, but poor soil is fine for wildflowers.
Okay, thank you.
So Hilary, Colin and Ivy have asked about what things did you use to make the bug house?
Oh, right. Again, there's instructions on the sheet that'll come round, but and you can look them up on the web. I think Friends of the Earth have got a good set of instructions. But basically, some old pallets, which you can scrounge from all sorts of places because it doesn't matter if they're a bit damaged. And then anything that will make lots of little crevices and holes for mini beasts, invertebrates to hide in. So old bamboo canes chopped up a bit. And in fact, a number of the ones I was using there were in old tree planting tubes. Big fir cones, pine cones, packing papers scrunched up and put inside old clay pots or old plastic pots, old egg boxes, just about anything that'll make little holes, bundles of twigs, hollow stems from things like hogweeds and cow parsleys and whatever their garden relatives you've got. That's the basic idea. There's no particular rules. It is anything that will have lots of crevices where there'll be shelter from the weather for little things to hide in.
And quickly, just another one from Kath. Just an observation. She's saying that she hasn't seen many butterflies this year. Is that usual?
Yes, it's entirely usual for Northwest England. We are very low numbers. I was talking to Butterfly Conservation rep David Costello just a couple of weeks ago, and the numbers are very poor. I was down the park this morning, and now we've got the summer ones out, gatekeepers, meadow browns, small whites. There were reasonable numbers this morning, but that is the first time I've really seen any good numbers for a while. This, I'm afraid, is all the usual reasons. It's climate change, it's habitat loss, it's lack of nectar and pollen all season, it's use of pesticides. Well, we're all going to do our bit to counter climate change, but the other things you can at least control in your churchyard. You can you can stop using the pesticides, and you can start try and get the more flowers and things in. So, but yeah, of course, the butterflies, they do need their food plants, which means with cabbage whites, they need the cabbage family, not necessarily cabbages, but the wild relatives mostly. And the same for all the other butterflies. You can look them up and see what their food plants are. Meadow browns and gatekeepers, they feed on long grass. So if you stop mowing some of your grass over summer, you might well get them colonize. And the point about nettles is actually they need sunny nettle beds. Butterflies, there are some moths that will feed on shady nettle beds, and it's the summer flying nettle flyers, the small tortoiseshells and the peacocks, which have had really horrible declines in the last 20 years, largely due to a parasitic fly getting in, but climate change isn't helping. So the figures are something like an 80% decline, and they used to be the butterflies we saw lots of at this time of year and into August. So we're missing those. But yeah, butterflies are very sensitive to environment, and they are just showing how badly our environment is going down.
I've read somewhere, Hilary, that there's a plant that you can grow called milkweed from seed. Now, in the United States, I think they've banned it. Would you recommend it being sown here?
No, because we don't have the butterfly that feeds on it. That's the butterflies of the United States are completely different food plants, and there's no point at all in growing milkweed in this country.
So,
okay, well, we need to move on. Thank you so much for your questions. If you've got any more, keep them to the end, or you can write them in the chat. But I'm going to bring Harriet in now, if that's all right. So Harriet is the director of Caring for God's Acre, which is a conservation charity dedicated to burial grounds of all types and sizes, from small rural churchyards to large urban cemeteries. She is an ecologist by training and has worked on nature reserves with farmers and other landowners on many community projects. Apart from being the director of Caring for God's Acre, her favourite job involves spending a couple of years on a seabird island in the Seychelles. I'd like to hear a little bit more about that. It must have been dreadful being stuck on the Seychelles for 2 years.
Oh, terrible. That's
So Harriet, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. It's very nice to be here. Now then, let me share my screen and get that going. Okay, maybe you could give a yell when it's appeared. That would be helpful.
All good.
Okay, brilliant. Well, it's so nice to be here and so lovely to see so many people, especially as it's sunny where you are. At least I'm wasting a not very lovely evening that's extremely overcast and horrible, whereas you're all giving us your time when you could be out in a beautiful sunny day. As you've heard, I work for Caring for God's Acre, conservation charity to do with burial grounds. And people often sort of say to me, that is quite specific. Why do burial grounds need their own conservation charity? And I'm just going to quickly sort of perhaps give you a little bit of a background as to why we think these places are so special. We estimate that we used to say there were about 20,000 burial grounds in England and Wales. That's definitely an underestimate. It's over 25,000. We know that now, and we still don't know exactly how many, partly because there are so many tiny little Welsh chapel yards and things like that. Covering an area about equivalent to the Isle of Wight or Exmoor National Park. So it's a really significant land holding. And unlike the Isle of Wight or Exmoor National Park, they are scattered right the way through our communities, not quite on the tops of mountains, but more or less everywhere else, in coastal areas, on different soils, on heathlands, on chalkland. So they really are the most perfect stepping stones for wildlife on the move, either in the face of climate change or just on the move because it moves and it's migrating and things like this. The other thing I think that's really special about burial grounds is an awful lot of them are looked after by volunteers, be it church communities, such as I think many of you here, church wardens and other volunteers, or friends groups for cemeteries, or whoever it may be. And again, you know, a very sort of plucked from the air figure. Our best guess is there's about 150,000 of you. You rarely call yourselves volunteers, but I think you jolly well should. And I think you should be extremely proud of the cumulative work that you're all doing in looking after these fantastic places for all the rest of us. And, you know, a small thing, but thank you very much from me. But I do think you should be thanked a great deal more than you are. So why are churchyards and cemeteries and chapelyards so brilliant? Well, if we just quickly look at the history of them, it gives you a bit of an idea. Many of them actually predate Christianity, and some predate Christianity, many predate Christianity in the UK. And we know these from the ancient yew trees. We can see that there are trees within these sites that are older than Christianity in the UK. So the belief is that pagan sites were used, pagan sacred sites that were then used for first churches when we became a Christian country. So the first amazing thing about them are the ancient yew trees. These are globally important. If one of you is a church warden or something with a churchyard that contains veteran yews, you are looking after something that is of global significance. And thank you again. But even the notable ones, I mean, look at that. What other tree would be called merely notable when it was 300 years old? It's not very kind, is it? So you've got a church that's comes in early on, maybe about a millennia ago, and a churchyard is sanctified. And the first thing that happens is consecrated. The first thing that happens is a boundary is put up around it to demark it from the rest of the land. And that might have been a fence, maybe a hedge early on, but quite quickly these tended to be stone walls, either lime mortared or dry stone walls. And this could well be the oldest enclosed land in a parish. Even if the church is much younger, the church might have been rebuilt many times, but that barrier is possibly one of the oldest structures in your area. So it might have been rebuilt over the years. The odd stone might have fallen out. People will have put it back in, but probably it hasn't changed much since there first was a church in this place, even if that church was a wooden hut that's been rebuilt and extended many times. So that wall in itself is a bit of a habitat. It's got all sorts of plants on it. This one you can see it's got a lovely load of ferns and mosses, have lichens on it. In amongst, there's all sorts of crevices there full of invertebrates. Reptiles and amphibians might well use this for sheltering, overwintering, and for feeding. You might find wrens and dunnocks hopping around, picking out all sorts of spiders and insects and other things. So the wall itself is a treasure. You often can have a bit of an idea whether you've got one of these really ancient sites by the shape of the churchyard. They tend to be more rounded than the later churchyards. This one is a church in a village near where I live called Clun. And you can see that rounded shape where I've put those red arrows on. Apparently the devil dwelt in the corners, so people believed a long, long time ago. So they tended to avoid corners. So one of the main things that you find on stones, as soon as something sits still for a while, be it a stone, a tree, or even a rubber dustbin lid, you get lichens starting to develop on it. And burial grounds, churchyards in particular, really are astonishingly good for lichens. The churchyard tended to be empty until about the 17th century, when it became the fashion to memorialise graves with permanent markers like these lovely stone gravestones. Prior to that, it was an open space used with all sorts of public uses. But once we've got these monuments in, it really becomes absolutely perfect for lichens, because not only are they different stone types, but very thoughtfully, somebody's really carefully carved out all sorts of nooks and crannies and letters and shapes and emblems that really make them perfect for different lichen species. So it's not unusual to have over 100 different lichen species in one churchyard. I think one of the most exciting things about churchyards is the grassland, because, and in a way, grassland is often the wrong word for it. So we've got that wall around this site that may be very old, and the grassland inside it reflects what was widespread at the time that ground was consecrated. And until about 60 years ago, that would have been flower-rich meadow full of a whole range of different flowering plants, native grasses, fungi, bacteria, invertebrates, all sorts of things, absolutely teeming with life. And we have lost about 97% of this habitat, and an awful lot of churches and cemeteries, churchyards and cemeteries, do contain it. If you sort of have a look, go and have a look at your churchyard and what you kind of had maybe been thinking was grass. Just have a really good look at it and look at the shapes of the leaves, and you may well be surprised and go, golly, it's not grass at all, it's flowering plants. So it's worth doing that. It's surprising how often they're really full of plants, and that's urban and rural sites alike. So we got this grassland, and this site might have been there for a really long time. And one of the key things about it is that the management is very, very consistent. So we live in a very crowded, changing country. Agriculture has changed beyond recognition in the last sort of 50, 60 years. We've had a lot of development, a lot of building, a lot of transport links, all sorts of things have happened. But actually, burial grounds haven't changed that much. So we know this because there's records of the vicar getting the hay crop as part of their stipend. So we know it was managed, it was grassland and it was managed for hay. There's also records of vicars being told off for growing turnips. So we know that that was bad, and they were supposed to keep them as an open space and not grow a crop like that in them. We have that hay crop happening, and then after that it would have just been lightly grazed to be kept as open ground, because again we know that people ran fairs in them, they had archery practice in them, so they weren't let run riot, they weren't let grow terribly long. After the hay they would have been kept as fairly short grass. Now our tools are different. Not many vicars get paid in hay anymore, and whenever I suggest it they don't like it one little bit, I've found, which is a bit disappointing. And most people don't graze churchyards anymore, but our tools are different. But actually, in terms of the habitat and the ecology, it doesn't make an awful lot of difference, provided, and this is a really crucial thing, you pick up your grass cuttings and take them away. Back in the day, grass was an incredibly valuable fuel, so nobody left it lying around to just rot down. It was either eaten by animals or it was taken away to feed them. So pick up your grass cuttings if you possibly can. Either compost them in a corner or take them off site. Many sites, we've been hearing some talk about it earlier on, are now managed as short grass, cut regularly and kept short. And I'm often asked, well, we've been managing it as short grass for ages, so presumably we've lost all the flowers because they don't get a chance to flower. And this is something that Hilary mentioned a bit as well. They're not annuals. These are not annual flowers. They are perennial flowers, with the exception of a few, yellow rattle being one. And so these are a couple of photos from Shrewsbury Cemetery, which was kept mowed and trimmed by 6 people for several decades until austerity struck, and they more or less stopped mowing and trimming it at all, and just put some nice paths through it and managed it as long grass. And this is year 1 after they stopped that cutting. So almost nothing had been allowed to flower until then, and the whole cemetery had just roared with the noise of mowers and strimmers, and then it transformed into this place full of flowers, buzzing with insects. It was absolutely astonishing. It's almost as if it's held in aspic, waiting to be released. So I've talked a bit about really old churchyards, and some of you might be sitting there going, well, I've got a Victorian church or a later church. What about me? So the Georgians were great church builders and openers of churchyards, as were the Victorians. And of course, also in the Victorian time, we got our fantastic civic cemeteries, which were open then. So it provided really your site is more than 50 or 60 years old, it probably will have been ancient meadow when it was consecrated, when that protecting wall went round. And Hilary's shown you lots of lovely examples of places that are perhaps later than that, but there's still flowers there and there's still things you can do to make them more flower rich. So as well as these sort of special things, you know, veteran yews, rare lichens, whatever, they also really have an awful lot of species that I remember as being quite common when I was young and are struggling and are greatly reduced in number. So they're special little hotspots of biodiversity. They're also brilliant places for people, places to unwind, to relax, to be. We might talk about this a little bit more in the chat, because we've had, I was thinking when both there was a question about people wanting it short and also a question about how people use churchyards. There's a bit of research into this, and more people visit churchyards just to be there than to either go into the building or to visit a known grave. So they are really treasured by the community, and possibly more than even the people managing them know. They're quiet, they're peaceful. When people are asked, the words quiet, tranquil, bird song, flowers, those are the things they say. They don't go, oh, it was really neatly mown and the toes of my shoes didn't even get damp. I've never heard them say that one. So there's a lot you can do to welcome more wildlife, and I'm just going to go through a few things. Excuse me, I'll go quickly over the things that Hilary's covered. Create a meadow. It can be small. And the thing about creating a meadow is to leave it uncut for 3 to 4 months and not longer than that. I think a very common mistake is to leave it for longer than that, thinking I must let everything flower, I must let everything set seed. It's if you leave it for too long that it starts to look tatty and you start to get complaints. So if it hasn't got spring flowers in, it hasn't got bulbs in, give it a cut in April, maybe towards the end of April, and then leave it till mid-July and try and get it cut in July or August. If it has got spring bulbs in and you can't do that spring cut, start looking for a window to cut it in mid-June. You will be cutting flowers, but don't leave it too long. Often if you cut things early, you get a second flush, you get second flowers again. So make a nice little meadow somewhere in an area that was short grass, that's in full sun, and just see what comes up, Look after your veteran trees, look after your mature trees as well. Clear saplings from underneath, give them a bit of room. Treat that soil, that root plate beneath the canopy as something really special, and don't put anything on it. Don't put grave spoil on it. Don't put piles of old bottles on it. Don't store the mower there. Don't park a car there. Just give the tree its roots and its access to oxygen in the soil. And also, it's a good idea to clear ivy off yews. It isn't off other trees. You don't need to on other trees unless your arborist says, I really need you to get the ivy off so I can see if it's safe. But yews, it is actually, the advice is do clear it off yews. Hilary's covered this, so I won't go over it much, but yeah, give wildlife a home and be a bit untidy. People love making boxes. They love putting them up. I've got a bishop there putting some Swift boxes behind the Louvre. Louvre's in that picture down there. But again, in a way, it's the natural things that really work for the wildlife. It's the scruffy area. It's the bit of scrub. It's the untidy bits that are really of particular value. But just start to think of it in a slightly different way. And plant for pollinators, not necessarily in your grassland, which may be full of flowers that are good for pollinators, and fine grasses are good for pollinators too. But if you've got flower beds, if you've got planters, if you've got things like that, again, plant for pollinators, use wildflowers, simple flowers, early and late nectar sources. So these are not nature reserves. They're not just wildflower places. They're places for people. And it's really important that we never forget these. And so there are ways to make them welcoming for people too, and to make that journey, that change together, and to make it as painless as it can be, that you will get some complaints and some people won't be happy with whatever you do. And again, Hilary's discussed this, make a plan. I love that simple plan with drawn with pencil with just A, B, C, D. That's all you need. That's perfect. If you'd like a bit of help making a plan, we've got an action pack. I can send you a link to that. And that just talks you through the process. And the first stage is always find out what's there. Talk to other people, try and draw other people in, find out people's views. Do keep having short grass in key areas. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about short grass, because short grass doesn't need to be that short. You can have what we would call medium grass instead of short. And to be quite honest with you, people don't really notice the difference. With medium grass, you just simply set the mower bar, the cutter bar higher, set it higher, and then all sorts of things will flower beneath it. And they will be things like the clovers, the medics, trefoils, daisies, things like that. We've spoken about thyme. That's one that would go down below the mower, and they can be absolutely brilliant for pollinators. If you've got short grass, but not as short as it is, you know, not that really deeply short stuff. It also stays green a lot longer in a dry year. And let people know what you're doing. Let them know in a variety of ways, as many ways as you can. Get out there and tell people what you're doing, and you'll find unlikely allies in places you didn't know that there were allies. And please run an event. Run an event. They're very popular. We've done an awful lot of events, and the feedback shows that people love them. You bring in a new audience who you haven't yet met, and they love what you're doing, and they're very interested in the wildlife within a churchyard or a cemetery. I don't know if any of you have come across Churches Count on Nature. If you're involved in Eco Church, you might well have done. It's an initiative with Caring for God's Acre, Church of England, the Church in Wales, and also Arusha, who run Eco Church. And we had over 350 churches taking part this year. It happens in June. So why not you aim to do something in Churches Count on Nature next year? We just ask people to do some sort of wildlife observation and let us know what they see. We've got an awful lot of resources, and I can easily put them in an email so they can be shared. And I just wanted to finish with a little word about carbon storage, because obviously you're working towards net zero. Mature soils store more carbon, and species-rich soils store more carbon than monocultures. So if you've got a mature churchyard soil with a lot of different species in, and you're letting it grow a bit longer, you're not mowing it short, so you've got a good deep root zone, which is all full of life and really active, that is storing a lot of carbon. We've done a bit of work on carbon in churchyard soils, and it seems that the trees and the grassland are storing roughly 50-50 each. So with the trees, you can see it above ground, you can see that there's carbon stored there. With the grassland, it's in the soil and it's less visible, but still really important. And I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Harriet, thank you. That was fascinating. Has anybody got any questions? Anybody else? My head is spinning with all these things. I want to write everything down. Wonderful stuff. Thank you so much, Harriet. Anybody got questions?
While
Sorry.
we're waiting for questions, I would just like to tell you about this survey that was done in Sussex. It was done about a little while ago now. It's about 6 or 7 years ago. But people were asked, it was churchyards that were managed for people and nature. Many of them were local wildlife sites. And people visiting were just filled in a survey, why they were there, how they felt about it, all sorts of things. And it was a really interesting survey. And my big take-home thing from it was that consistently across over 50 churchyards, there was about 3% of people who were really unhappy about seeing wildlife there. There was one person who said that seeing wildlife made them feel angry. So yeah, but it was 3% consistently. So church wardens and vicars, they know those 3%. They are really, they're complainers. They're complainers. They make their views felt. But, and I'm not suggesting that you don't listen to them and take their problems seriously and their opinions very seriously, but try and hear the voice of the 97%. Try and ask wider. Go outside of your normal community and seek opinion. You will often be pleasantly surprised on things like having longer grass, having flowers, having nature, having kids running around doing events, those sorts of things.
That's really good advice. And yeah, I love the idea of telling people in the community why you're doing or why you're not doing what they expect you to do. And I think that's really key, isn't it? Is communicating with the community. I think that's really important. Anybody got any questions? We are sort of quickly racing towards the end. We've got 50 minutes. We've still got another speaker to go. Has anybody got a quick question for Harriet, and then we can hang around at the end if people want to, or put things in the chat? No, we're okay. All right, if it's okay, then I'll bring in our last two speakers, and then we can always sum things up at the end and have a discussion. So I'd like to introduce Drew and Annette James. They attend Christ Church in Toxteth Park, where Annette has been a licensed lay minister for over 30 years. Both are retired from professional posts and are both Christian climate activists. They have 4 children and 4 grandchildren. Annette has a background in NHS and local government with public health. She is passionate about social justice and food sustainability and is a trustee of 2 local charities. Annette was very involved in drawing together documents and evidence when Christ Church achieved their Gold Eco Church Award, which she says is a good start. And Drew is a retired solicitor, and in an earlier life he was a youth and community worker for the Church of England in Toxteth, and he is the net zero lead for Christ Church in Toxteth. So over to you two. Thank you.
Thanks, Emma. We'll start sharing our screen, which is that one, I think. Oh, no, not that one, that one.
Hello, everyone. Christ Church has held a place at the heart of our urban community near Sefton Park, Liverpool, for over 150 years, since consecration in 1871 by the then Bishop of Chester. The next image is of Christ Church, and it was taken by Google Street View in 2008. You'll see we've got no graveyard and very little land, but we are committed to preserving and protecting the natural environment that God has entrusted to us, both as a church and as a community. By the turn of this century, Christ Church was home to a tiny worshipping community within a huge Victorian pile, surrounded by a sea of tarmac, much of which is used as pedestrian access to the streets that are east and west of the building, and sprinkled with litter, dog poo, and fly tipping. In 2008, creation of the gardens was the vision of our then curate, Alistair Prince, known as the Dancing Vicar, who joined us in 2006. Prior to ordination, he'd been a horticulturist. Alistair set up a small group to look at transforming the land around the church into gardens. Funding was sourced from a body that offered finance for projects connected with the abolition of slavery. So the then planting was designed to reflect the triangle of countries involved in the slave trade, the UK, Africa, the Americas. And so one of the features was at this triangle of silver birch trees seen here maturing at the east gate, and now attract goldfinches and other small birds. The front garden was designed for aesthetics, whereas the back was intended to be an allotment space with productive trees. You see these here, soft fruit bushes and ground cover. Volunteers from the church worked with 2 local groups, Asylum Link and a mental health project. Creating and maintaining the garden became part of the therapeutic purposes for these groups. And this continued for a few years until the mental health team was disbanded and Alistair moved on to another parish. The gardens have been cared for in various ways since then. Pete Gibbons, an ex-teacher, built relationships with local hostels and encouraged them to be involved in growing and maintenance, and then sadly he died 3 years ago. We were also blessed with a retired woman, Rita Langman, who loved gardening, and she planted the front planter with seasonal colour, watered the plants regularly and kept things in check.
Yeah, I was involved in putting together our application for Gold Eco Church, and the gardens were a key part of our bid. That was in 2018. And we were assisted by yet another member of our congregation, Sam Illingworth. He inspired the installation of bird boxes, hedgehog houses and bug houses to add to the mix of trees, shrubs and plants that were already attracting insects, bees and butterflies. The children at Christ Church conducted an audit, and then they were involved in seed planting. Currently, Catherine Topping, another member of our church, is horticulturalist and a church member. She takes the lead and organises work parties to maintain planting and to ensure that we encourage as wide a selection of wildlife as possible. Volunteers from the church and from the local community deepen relationships as we work together and care for our mental well-being as we garden. Well, why have a garden? Well, it looks nice. It's colourful, it's alive. It reminds us that we are but a part of creation, and it sends a message that we're here. It's good land management. It's better for the environment to have the land planted up. It's more sustainable and a much better use of the resources that we have. So that is having soil rather than tarmac, which is much better than for water management. Having the garden reduces runoff and flooding. The garden makes the footpaths that are either side of the church really pleasant for people to walk through, and they are really well used. Yeah, and it's an opening for conversations as well about caring for the earth, both with the church, with our neighbours and with the local community. We are climate activists, and we really encourage people to think about how we live and what our personal responsibility is, as well as corporate working together. This rowan tree was actually planted in memory of Irene MacDonald, who was a much loved member of Christ Church community. The garden lifts people's spirits as they come to church, and while they wait for the church to open for our food pantry sessions during the week. And sometimes people are outside for a couple of hours before we open. And it's well known in our local community and for others as well, that access to the outdoor space is really, really important for our mental health. New plants are chosen for their attractiveness to pollinators, not just bees, but hoverflies, butterflies. And we aim to have something in flower every month of the year as far as possible. And we also aim to have that attractive space for people to walk through all through the year as well. Obviously, we've already talked about, Harriet's already talked about climate change and how important the outside areas and gardens are for that and the land. We encourage and support bees and other pollinating insects. These are some in the garden, and we do have actually some butterflies in the gardens already. We've seen some this year, not all whites, but others as well. But we have dead hedges as well, which offer a habitat, and including places for insects and wildlife to overwinter. We know bees are subject to threats from pesticide used in farms and gardens, and also from the destruction and fragmentation of habitat. One of the things in urban areas is that many people pave over their front gardens to create driveways or replace their lawn with artificial grass. And we can actually open conversations with people about thinking of living in an urban area, yet still caring for the land and recognizing that we are part of the whole creation. We did actually consider beehives in the church tower just before lockdown, but then as lockdown started, that got shelved. So we may revisit that again. We recycle as much as we can in the garden, composting our green waste in bins and in open piles. And these 3 bins at the back that you see were built from recycled wood with an organisation called Compost UK. They came and made 1 box, and then gradually we filled that, had a second, and then had a third. And local people, we've got 40 local people that have a code to get into one of the boxes, and then they are rotated. So there's always one that's being filled, one that's sort of maturing, and then one is ready for composting about every 3 months. And we also have some pony poo from the local Princess Park ponies, just about half a mile away, again in the urban area. So we use kitchen waste, we use the garden waste, and we use other resources that are available to us. We don't buy anything unless it's absolutely necessary. All the compost made on site or donated, and we put the compost when it's matured back on the ground, and that which we don't need, local people take for their gardens. We don't feed the plants with artificial feed, but we aim to feed the soil by the composting and mulching. And new plants are either grown from seed or donated from divisions or propagation from some of the church members. We garden organically, we don't use pesticides or weed killers. So just to sum up, really, it's just hopefully given you a little bit of an idea about some of the things that we're doing in our church. Just telling you about digging up the concrete, which was a bit of a shocking thing at the time, but as you've heard as well, some of the tarmac is degrading, and we are looking to degrade it further so that we can have more plants, more wildlife around the church. I've mentioned a number of people, and I think it's important to have leaders who are working with us in the church, who have knowledge and experience of horticulture and growers, either because they've studied it or because they just have an interest and they're able to open themselves and the church to other partners. And I think we've mentioned a couple of times how important partnership working has been for us for physical and mental health, as well as managing the garden. We have monthly maintenance sessions, which Catherine leads, with community and church volunteers, and lots of the people who use the church for the pantry, the food bank, and other things have started to come and garden with us as well. So we're hopefully spreading the word. The wildflower garden provides fresh flowers for the church. People love having fresh flowers on the table when they're coming for tea and cake. And also we know that we are enjoying the garden alongside the wildlife, the bees, the birds, the insects, and the hedgehogs. We aim to share in our urban area an environmentally friendly way of working with land and have a sustainable approach to community gardening. And we're passionate about composting, which I've mentioned a few times. It can get a bit messy sometimes, especially when we have to dig out the compost ourselves. We have to get our wellies on and dig out inside the bin. A small amount of fruit is grown at the back of the church, mainly apples, pears, and soft fruits. And anyone in the community can come and pick that. And most years, we have someone bringing us a jar of jam that they've made from the fruit. So I hope that's given you a little bit of an insight of what can be done in an urban church. Certainly, Gold Eco Church was a start for us to begin to look at how we could get better and better use of the land. And we have learned a lot this evening. So thank you so much for inviting us to come, and thank you for the presentations that we've watched too.
Just to wrap up, what are the challenges that we're facing? Well, we've still got this 150-year-old Victorian building, which is very difficult to maintain, and we're a small community of worshippers. The garden is it's a small area, so we're limited the space we have to work with. It's a thoroughfare on both sides of the church, so none of it is private. The heavy iron gates are useless now. They can't be moved. So we still have problems from time to time with fly tipping and litter. Also, keeping the garden watered in hot, dry weather is an issue. Still getting deposits from local dogs, graffiti, and just everybody being so busy and not always able to give the time that the garden really needs. So that's the end of our piece. Thank you.
Thanks ever so much, Annette and Drew. Wow, lots of amazing things that you're doing, and I hope that's really encouraged other people to have a go, or maybe even just to get started with something. But does anybody want to ask anything specifically about perhaps their journey or what they've done, or any advice that they might want to give? Feel free to just unmute yourself. Rachel.
Hi, thanks Annette and Andrew. That was lovely to see your church garden. It's really inspiring. I was wondering if, I know some other churches are just starting out. I was wondering if it'd be possible for them to come and visit your site, either on one of your maintenance days or another arranged date.
Absolutely, yeah. We're really, really happy to share, because when we're sharing, we actually learn from each other. So yeah, we'd be more than happy for people to come and have a look.
I think particularly during your gardening sessions, because that might inspire them to do something similar or give a couple of ideas.
Yeah, so they're usually on a Wednesday evening, 6 till 8, and not every Wednesday evening though, so you'd have to let us know when you're interested in coming. I think we've got one next week. Next Wednesday we'll be there.
Good to know.
Anybody else? John? Just unmute yourself, John.
I'm going to take my headphones off because I can't hear myself. One of the things we're doing at St. Luke's in Crosby is we're trying to think of when we're not going to be able to manage it like we are at the moment. We do cut. We have a big petrol mower, which is like a tractor mower, and we've also invested in electric battery stuff, which is pretty good. They're smaller, they're not as efficient, they're more expensive to buy, I suppose. Not as efficient in terms of time, but we've planted 60 saplings, mainly rowan, some malus, little crab apples, and some birch, which we put in the places of the headstones which have been removed. They've either fallen down or they were never put there. So we've got now probably about 105, 110 saplings, so that in 50 years' time, the ground will not be it's not a wasteland, but an open grassy area. It will be a little woodland. And that's our plan. It's, I think it will be controversial because we do have 97% of our visitors saying it's lovely, but some people have this view that the Church of England is absolutely loaded, and that we get a grant from somebody, I don't know who it is, and we're able to employ somebody every day to cut the grass within an inch of its life. We still have that. I think we probably have 8-10 complaints each summer, although we've got yellow rattle, although we've got other stuff going on. But the trees, I think one day, our woodland graveyard, I think, will be a beautiful story of how we have had to change the management. It's partly economic, but it's mainly ecological.
Thank you for sharing that, John.
Okay.
Anybody else? Kath, did you want me to ask your question, or do you want to?
I can ask it as well if you want. So it was more a case of, you mentioned graffiti and dog waste, but have you had any problems with vandalism of the plants themselves at all? Because we're having real problems with kids like basically throwing things around in our church garden, and we're a bit at a loss at what to do with it at the minute.
Well, off the top of my head, I would say involve them in planting them in the first place. They'd be less likely to take them out. But when we first dug up the tarmac and the bits of concrete, when we first did that, we put lots of different plants in, and they looked really attractive, and lots of them disappeared. But I used to run a Sure Start Centre, and we did get a grant to make the grounds beautiful, and had lots of willow tunnels and all kinds of things. And the plants used to be taken all the time. So we thought the area where the Sure Start Centre was, all the people around had wonderful gardens, and our Sure Start Centre had very little. But we just had to wait it out and invite people in, get people gardening with us, and just recognize that actually people like nice plants. If they're going to look after them, okay, fine, but we actually don't buy anything now, to ask people to propagate, or to give a cutting, or to bring something, or maybe ask people to donate plants if you're finding that it's very expensive to keep replacing them. But I think one thing that you shouldn't do is make it a barrier for young people. So sometimes if they feel, if you're thinking, oh, young people are taking our plants, that sometimes can be a barrier. So please don't make it a barrier, to try and welcome the young people in, and try and encourage them to work with you. And sometimes you have to bite your lip and think, well, hopefully they're enjoying the plant. That might not be the answer you want, but that's what I would think.
Fair enough, thank you.
Good advice. Anybody else? Anybody want to share perhaps what they're doing in their church yards, gardens, even if it's a little tiny space?
One little
Sorry, Jo.
It's all right. One little tip is I've been growing Bocking 14. It's a comfrey, and it's not the type of comfrey that spreads around by underground roots. It's very self-contained, and it doesn't self-seed either, and it's Russian Bocking 14 comfrey. And what I've been doing is I've been chopping it down and then chopping it with scissors, and used it as a mulch around rhubarb. And it's really good in the summer if you're trying to slow down water loss from around the soil. So I thought I'd just drop that in. And also that if you grow borage, which is an annual, very pretty flowered blue annual, when that gets to the end of the season, what you can do is, if you put that into your compost, it'll add a lot of extra minerals, which is going to go back into your soil when you mulch in September.
I'll support that one, Jan. Very good. All the borage family are very good for this. If you want a fairly shallow-rooted ground cover plant, try the creeping comfrey, which has white flowers in March, April, and the bees love it. But it will spread by runners, but it's fairly shallow-rooted, so you can put it out when it gets places you don't want it. And like all the comfreys, yes, use it as a mulch, use it as your compost heaps.
Well, I found the Russian Bocking 14, which doesn't self-seed, and it doesn't develop underground roots. I've had it growing in my garden 30 odd years, and I brought some down to use in the raised beds, and the bees have just loved it.
They do. I've got blocking in the garden, but I also have the creeping one.
Yeah. Oh, right. Okay, thank you.
Well, we have gone 6 minutes over time. Sorry to have kept some of you longer than perhaps you thought, but it has been a really, really interesting and lovely evening. If there's anything that anybody would like to say or comment on, now's your time to do so. Otherwise, we'll end there. But can I just say thank you so much to Hilary and Harriet and Annette and Drew for all that you have contributed this evening. It has been absolutely wonderful, and I'm looking forward to watching the video back and taking more notes. But it's been wonderful. But if anybody'd like to say anything now, please feel free if you want to hang around and chat and share things, that's fine. Otherwise, thank you so much. And yeah, look, keep checking our website for other things that we're offering, and I will certainly share around all the resources that have been shared this evening. And if it's okay with Annette and Drew, if I can put perhaps some dates of some of your maintenance evenings for people to come along and say hello. If you let me know those dates, I'll happily share those with people. And again, just set up some networking, which I think is really good, especially if you're starting out. It's good to network and get ideas and meet other people.
There's one question in the chat we perhaps ought to pick up, which is about nettles and caterpillars and when to cut the nettles down.
Yes.
Well, apart from cutting them down at the end of the season, obviously, it is, if you actually do have the nettle living butterflies, they have a spring generation and then some of them have a summer generation. So it's worth trying to cut some of the nettles down in June, and the fresh new growth will then support the second generation. But at the moment, as I say, some of the things like peacocks and small tortoiseshells, if you have got them, please look after them because they're so rare now. But that's the real answer to the nettles question.
Thank you for picking up on that.
I've got to head off, but I just want to say thank you. And Annette and Drew, I'd love to come and pick your brains again, because I've come to Christ Church Toxteth when you had the compost workshop. I think it was earlier this year, and I really enjoyed that. But just to pick your brains on Gold Eco Church, because we're a bronze at the minute, and I'm just struggling to get the congregation engaged. So I'd really love to come and pick your brains about that.
Okay. Yeah, I think Emma will have your email, so if she puts us in touch, that'd be great. Thank you. I'm sorry, I have another Zoom. I have to go.
Oh,
so sorry.
No, please go. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Rachel.
See
you tomorrow.
Bye.
Bye. Oh, thanks, everyone.
Okay, looks like everyone's going. Do you think, Emma?
Yeah. Oh, thank you.
I'll get my tea now.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much for all that effort you put in beforehand and for this evening as well. It's been a really, really lovely evening and a wealth of information shared there. It's been fascinating. I would like to have heard more. It's a pity I didn't have longer really to share and talk more, but no, it's been absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, thank you for organising.
Oh no, you're very welcome.
Very nice to meet you, Louis.
Yeah, you too. And we'll keep in touch and hopefully our paths will cross again.
Well, I should certainly see you, but yes.
Yeah. So thanks ever so much.
Right.
I'm going to sign off now. Good night. God bless.
Good night. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye.